Hello, everyone. I'm Colleen Johnson, the CEO of ProKanban.org, and we are here today for our next installment of Kanban for Everyone. This is going to be an exciting conversation today. A lot of content is out there, and a lot of questions come up about the right environments to either pick. What should I use Kanban for? What should I use Scrum for? And I think there's a lot of misinformation circulated about certain environments or certain types of development work being better suited to one type of approach here or another. And so we're going to do a little bit of myth busting here today. I'd love to introduce you all to Agile coach and member of the Pro Kanban community, Adam Griffith.
Hi.
Adam, tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Hi. Yeah. So I've been I was a developer for about 10 years, something like that, and then moved into sort of development management and got very, very involved with first Scrum, and then recently sort of found out and joined the Pro Kanban community. I've been working very much to try and use some of what I've learned and what we've been working on to help our teams and use the lessons and share the knowledge really a little bit. So yeah, when the opportunity came up to sort of talk about Kanban and Scrum together, it's like, yeah, okay, this is something I'm really, really interested in. So no guarantees I've got all the answers, but it's definitely a topic I'm really, really passionate about.
Yeah, well, welcome, Adam. We're really excited to have you here. And we've had some really great conversations with you, both in the Slack community and through some of the blog posts that you've provided in sharing some of your stories. But that's exactly what we'll do here today. So I would love to just kick it off by talking a little bit about what your starting point looked like. So what were your Scrum teams doing that, that made them want to explore maybe adding Kanban, and what was working well for them from a Scrum perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of our teams were doing pure Scrum. So we've got the standard structure lots of people will be aware of. You do your sprints, you do sprint planning, daily scrums, retrospectives, sprint reviews, that sort of thing, and you work through, you iterate towards a product goal. I think what a lot of the teams were finding challenges about was estimating how much work can they get done in a sprint. So it's the classic challenge, right? We're going to start a sprint planning session. We're going to sign up to all of this. And what about the work that's already in flight? What do we do about that? And how much work do we pick up? Do we pick down our standard sort of projects? And the other things was wanting to zoom out a little bit and understand, we've got clients who are talking about, this year, later this year, next year, what does that roadmap look like? And the inevitable challenges of, well, we think, this is what we're looking at the moment, but things popping up, work taking longer than expected, and sort of those roadmap schedules changes. And Scrum doesn't address that. It doesn't try to address that. It's a framework with deliberate gaps in it for you to fill and implement. So yeah, those were some of the challenges that we were looking at and we were facing quite day to day.
Yeah. So, and then when in thinking about what was working or maybe those things that you were struggling with, it sounds like you started to explore how Kanban might be able to help in those situations. What brought you to Kanban?
So I was having a talk with a friend and about the other guys and the certificates, and I was working my way through the Scrum Master certificates with Scrum.org, and I was chatting, and I was talking about, oh well, I'd do this, and I had story point that, and so on, and he sort of looked at me and said, you should have a look at the PSK, their professional Scrum with Kanban courses, and find out a little bit more about that. And I got reading a little bit more. I always like a challenge of finding out, because for me, Kanban was always, it's the other gang, oh, that's for service desks, right? That's for ticketing systems and things like that. And sure enough, I respected this guy to have a bit of a read, and I read a few books, read some of Dan Vacanti's work, and I just opened this. I got to the bit where it shows the cycle time scatter plots, and I just got that. I just held that a second, and then the mind just went bang, right, okay, this is, and that just really sparked for me, because suddenly we're talking about variability in the work we're doing, and actually this is normal and this is predictable, and that we shouldn't actually using historical data. And we talk when teams are using story points, we talk about trying to compare against old work, but actually using the cycle times and using the how long did it actually take, and plotting that going forward. I thought, this is something that would be awesome. And I started downloading our sort of old data and plugging it in and started looking, thinking, oh, okay, so these are our SLEs, if we go with the 85th and things like that, and thinking, yeah. So then we started sort of knowledge sharing across the teams, and it turned out some of the teams were already really quite interested in a lot of this stuff, and we're jumping at the opportunity to learn a little bit more in sort of a more structured way. And then we've had some, should we say, some pockets of resistance who are still very, very keen that actually what they've got works for them, which is fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I've run into that as well. And I think there can be some skepticism in the data too, of feeling like maybe it doesn't reflect well on the team's efforts sometimes. What kind of resistance did you run into when you first started making changes for the team?
I think the WIP limits, that's probably teams' hardest ones to accept. And I'm very much a wouldn't turn around and say to a team, this is how you need to do something. This is these are the mandated rules. What we're trying to do is, this is what Kanban is. These are the steps of Kanban. These are the rules of Kanban, and actually trying to explain why. And then teams adopting more and more of their practice. And although I think, what course was I on, but it was described very much as the idea is Kanban is immutable, and we want teams to be following the whole lot because it's all designed to work together as a single system. But that doesn't mean a team needs to pick up everything and start doing everything from day one by the book without understanding how it applies to their context. So yeah, WIP limits were one of our okay, that's maybe going to take a little bit of convincing, and there are some teams that are still not very much convinced by that.
And what kind of things helped you convince them, for the ones that you did, where you feel like you crossed that bridge?
There's a few. I think what people like, we like collaboration, and we like working very much alongside people. And I think that's almost encouraging the collaboration aspect of it, rather than, you must not have more than 2 active stories or however many in that column, and actually seeing it as a chance of paired programming and a lot of things that people want to do, and using that as almost pushing the benefit rather than the rule, and then actually formalizing at a later date.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, so we're talking a little bit here about implementing WIP limits. And I think for a lot of teams, one of the first conversations that comes up when we start talking about WIP limits, if it's a Scrum team, is whether or not they're using subtasks. What level of the board do you apply WIP limits at, right? So a lot of teams will have like a subtask for development and a subtask for testing and maybe a subtask for deployment on a story. And the story doesn't move till the subtasks are done. So when we start thinking about like, where do we start from implementing some Kanban perspectives and practices, I think the first thing we usually start to look at is, how is our work broken down, and at what level do we want to start moving the work and applying WIP limits to those work items? Where did you start?
So I actually think this is something we were doing quite well before. So different teams use different approaches as you want, but generally we had quite wide boards. So it was I've seen lots of teams where, you have to do, doing, done. That's the extent of their Kanban boards. But actually much more I was seeing, there was a lot of breadth. For example, these are stories that are being broken down, these are stories that are being analyzed and ready. Then you've got, right, these are being actively developed, these are the ones where the tests are being created, these are the ones that are being promoted to the various environments and through to the production. So already, you can see the beginnings of a definition of workflow in there. We just didn't necessarily know the name for it. So the next step was almost, again, definition of done. What should be in on there, what shouldn't be in on there, and then starting to think about, actually, is that something that should be done there, or is that something that should be done a little bit earlier in the process, and thinning out the definition of done into the the column exit and entry criteria that you would see. So yeah.
And I think, when we start to see that switch to the boards, I think a lot of teams, like they'll start to refine their workflow, like you said, trying to understand the definition of workflow and how that applies in a Scrum context. But it doesn't mean we get it right out of the gate, right? It's like, where are we going to start? I think most teams I've worked with tend to maybe make too many steps in their workflow at the beginning, and maybe that adds to having too much work in progress early on. What kind of things did you see them start to iterate on or refine once they got their Kanban, once they started adding these Kanban practices to Scrum?
I think a lot of it's about adding in detail. It's almost hang on, we've done this, and did we have the appropriate number of reviewers on the pull request? Actually, that can be enforced by a policy and it's done elsewhere, but it's nice to be able to capture that and put it in, it's part of the workflow. It isn't necessarily documented. So yeah, I think it was more around that. Where I've not seen as much yet is sort of using the flow metrics to start informing the decisions and the retrospectives. Actually, what was significant about this one, and potentially work item aging. And I feel awful saying that to you because obviously, yeah, the pocket Kanban bar just like rule one: focus on age work as you're going through for flow. But I think that's something I would like to see doing more of, because that encourages people to swarm on the most at-risk tasks, right?
Yeah. Well, and I saw a post recently on LinkedIn. I can't remember the author, but it said basically if you're starting to add Kanban practices, whether it's just Kanban or Kanban with Scrum, don't expect it to make things better early in the process. It's probably just going to expose a lot of broken things that you weren't able to see before. And I loved that it's kind of a public service announcement, I guess, but I think a lot of organizations feel like if we're going to switch things or add things or put new practices in place, it should fix all our problems right away. But really, a lot of what we're trying to do with our definition of workflow and visualizing that workflow is making where the work gets stuck more visible so we can address it. What things came to surface at the beginning for your teams in terms of, like you said, the code review or pull requests? Were there other things that the team maybe couldn't see the way they were working before?
I think there was maybe a bit of so one of my early sort of experiments while I was doing this, and I said this to you before the call, I've got to look back at this and think all the things that I said, and then actually things I've learned since then. But one of the ones I look back at now and think about was I was very fixated on, okay, if I do a Monte Carlo forecast versus a story point forecast and track these, which of these dates is going to be more accurate? And that was my experiment. I ran work over time about which one, and then the idea was I would look at the end result and I would look at, right, okay, so clearly Monte Carlo is far more accurate at predicting where we're going to be wrong. And I sort of look back at those experiments now and think, well, that's embarrassing, because it's not about accuracy. It's about understanding the risk of how likely it is it's going to run late, and almost by shifting that dial up to the 85, 90th percentile or whatever risk you're comfortable with, you're not saying that's when it's going to land. In fact, you're kind of hoping it's not. You're kind of hoping it's going to be a lot earlier. But what you're doing is you're limiting your risk of it. And yeah, I've gone now when I'm presenting a lot of my material in my courses. I've got a disclaimer at the bottom that says something along the lines of, these issues and these challenges about forecasting multiple work items are already there. The only thing is, this makes it visible.
Right. Yeah. And how about from the team's perspective? It's fun when we do a lot of simulations in the Pro Kanban training classes. I always love to sit and write down quotes that I hear people say of like, hey, I think if we look at how old the ticket is, right, and focus on that, we'll get things done faster. Or were there aha moments that you got to watch the team have where you were like, yes?
So my favorite one was when I was doing a piece of work. Again, there was a very specific question from a team, and I tried not to go in with an agenda, but the question was around planning how much work we could get done in a sprint, because the team were finding they were carrying more work over and so on. So the scenario I devised to help them do this was create a whole bunch of cards with the cycle times of how long a piece of work actually took from they'd ever starting the coding to when it was marked as done in the system using their definitions. And what I asked them to do was, right, okay, so this one's 1 day, this one's 5 days, this one's 40 days, or whatever it was. Put these in, which bucket of story points do you think these were in? And sure enough, all the ones went in the ones, and the 2 days, and they all went out fairly linearly. And then I did the, right, you can now remove this slide, and it was a complete mix up. You couldn't have randomized them any better. And I think team members looked at that and thought, but those were their estimates that they thought about, because obviously it's done on sizing and it's done on complexity. And they were looking at this and thinking, hang on a minute. And then, your initial reaction to that was, well, our estimation is rubbish. We need to get better at estimating work. We need to understand things like that. But actually, when I started talking about the majority of time on, cycle time isn't necessarily about sat writing code or sat writing tests or doing that. It's the weights between. Yeah. And what the idea of being able to track, when we're moving across, particularly if you've got, both do and done splits on your critical columns, let you see actually this is where the time is going. Yeah, there were a few sort of lights going off behind people's heads there of starting to pick things up.
That's brilliant. Did you use a tool to visualize the difference between the cycle time and the story points, or was it just a manual?
No, I just export it. So I use their data because it
Yeah.
was their estimates. And that might sound really cruel, but estimates were always given with the best of intentions and based on the understanding at the time. And I think, part of this journey and part of this learning is that we're not going to get them all right. It's incredibly difficult. Work is always more complicated, and we're engineers. We're optimistic. We're used to solving problems. So the whole, we anticipate we're going to solve them. So yeah, actually playing their own data back. So no, in terms of tools, it was simply an export and me sort of manually copying them onto cards and then doing the big reveal at the end.
That's awesome. I love that. So after going through that process, did you see any changes in how they were starting to right size stories, or and when in the process they were starting to have those conversations?
So this was quite recent. So the team at the moment are talking about, actually when we pull in this work, because then what I did is I produced their team sprint Monte Carlo for capacity over 21 days. I think they're running. So just that we're starting on just that bit of awareness of actually, okay, these stories are already flights we might think, but we'd still need to get a throughput of X during this sprint to be able to do things. Are you feeling confident? What I like about putting the two systems together, probably jumping ahead a little bit here in the questions, is that what teams previously relied on gut feel, they can actually look at a number. And okay, it's a lightning does strike, right? The unlikely does happen, but be able to actually numerically judge how likely or unlikely something is. So yeah, okay, I'm comfortable with that. Let's be ambitious this sprint. Actually, yeah, maybe we're being a bit too ambitious. When you actually run the probability of the number of stories some teams have in sprints based on their throughput, how likely it is they were going to complete, some of those numbers came out really quite surprising.
Yeah, the data. I mean, the data is I think such a great thing to anchor back to, and I typically do very similar process or practice to what you said, where I track both for a while. I don't try to take story points away from the team or tell them they can't do backlog refinement anymore. But it's like, how do we start to do both of these practices in parallel so that the data helps us see maybe a different way of doing it, or where there's waste and other methods that we're doing.
If I said the journey I like is inform a teams about a different way of doing things. If you don't know about it, you've got no option to be able to swap onto it. Let them try it again. Encourage in parallel, because it might be, this team might be the best at estimating you have ever seen, and genuinely it might be phenomenal.
I want to talk to that team.
Well, yeah. But also there's different types of work, isn't there? Some work is much more complex and we a lot more variation in it versus I not seen it that much in software myself. But then yeah, actually you've got the teams working the two models side by side, and let's just give this a go. Sorry, my camera's can't find me for something. And you want to work on the two side by side, and then the goal is almost for the team to lose confidence on that journey. You think, you know what, actually these I don't want to use that system anymore. I want to embrace this and do that as a team.
Yeah. Well, I think you've kind of answered some of this, Adam, but when you think about the relationship that Scrum and Kanban have and what they can provide to each other, what's the most valuable thing that Kanban brings to Scrum?
Making data-based decisions. So, being able to Scrum doesn't provide anything about forecasting. It doesn't focus on anything about flow. It doesn't try to do that. Despite the weight that's carrying along, story points are not part of Scrum.
Right.
I've read that Scrum guide several times. They're not part of that. It's got carried along in the wake. So Scrum does not attempt to answer those questions about improving flow of work through, improving predictability, improving your forecasts, both short and medium range, what you're going to achieve in the sprint. It doesn't try. All it does is provide a structure to be able to refine and pivot as needed. So those are the bits that I find really exciting, because then you've got these two systems, and you depending on the risk of what you're trying to do, if your risk is that we're going to build something that's completely useless for the customer, we're going to go off on a complete tangent, then Scrum is great, because it's a framework to be able to check in with the stakeholders and say, right, on a tempo, we are going to show you where we are, what we've got, what we've created, what we've learned, what are the changes in the market, and be able to anchor back to those conversations. Equally, when you're then forecasting forward and saying, okay, can we get any more done by looking at where work's getting stopped, where it's sitting in queues, that sort of thing. That's where Kanban comes in, and improving the flow of work through, and understanding where those forecasts are landing at, and managing the risk associated with that as well, not just, oh, well, we think it's going to be this date.
Yeah. As Pratik always says, it helps us find out we're building the wrong thing faster, right? Or validate or get that feedback basically faster, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm reading his book at the moment. I should be a little bit further through, but yeah, and he's talking very much about, actually, your cycle time is not just a number. It's about how long it takes you to find out whether you're doing the right thing. So the shorter that is, the less time you are investing in trying to not just deliver the value, but validate that what you're trying to do is right.
Yeah. Well, alternatively, what do you think what does Kanban get from Scrum? So what does Scrum provide to Kanban?
So I think it's that anchor of conversation, because I think, now I've never worked in a team which is pure Kanban. We don't use any Scrum. So I'm sort of imagining the side of risk for that, but I imagine it's possible to go very, very quickly in completely the wrong direction. Particularly if we're working in that complex area where, we're just churning out work, you could put so much time and effort into something that isn't valuable, doesn't meet a customer needs, and ultimately, you can imagine the startup just crashing and burning, because they're building absolutely fantastic stuff that nobody wants. So having that structure of conversations around about, engaging with stakeholders, potential customers, saying, okay, this is what we're building next, and this is what we're on track to, it helps that structure.
Yeah, I've actually seen exactly what you just described, right? I worked with one organization where they said, we're going to stop doing Scrum, we're going to start doing pure Kanban. And every work item that got pulled into in progress got basically stuck there while it went through review by the team, and kind of, what is this work, and understanding the scope. And it was almost like we were doing a lot of the refinement work that happened from a Scrum perspective prior to the sprint starting. It was happening once each individual work item got pulled into in progress, and then it would get stuck there while we were trying to figure out the answers to those questions. And for that team, they created some really clear workflow policies around what had to be true before a work item could go into the to-do column. It still needed to be reviewed by the team to say, is this small enough? Is it valuable? Can we get it done underneath our service, our service level expectation threshold? So it was still going through refinement of sorts, right? But maybe not on a cadenced basis. It was happening right as things were getting pulled into that to-do column. But I think that's a great example of what you're saying. Like, a lot of what Scrum provides in terms of those reviews and collaboration to look at how things are working and what we're going to work on next. That still needs to happen in some capacity for a Kanban team. You can't get rid of that. Or you have exactly that scenario where work gets pulled in and gets stuck immediately.
I think it's great for creating a short-term deadline and focus for teams as well. So obviously you can vary, a team can have a sprint any length up to a month, but the idea that a team should produce at least one increment of their product per month, and that is going to go out and it's going to meet their definition of done, whatever it is. I think that's very, very powerful to create a time bound. I mean, I've worked in organizations in the past where, you can be deploying once every 6 months or longer, and, physically you're printing the CD and then you go to the customers the other day and you think, that's not really that fast feedback cycle we want on whether we're delivering the right stuff. But actually to create that tempo. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions about both strategies on both sides. And the idea that, I think one of the ones about Scrum is that you need to wait for the sprint review. You can't produce anything until the sprint review. But actually, that's just a grouping up of, did we meet the sprint goal? Should we? The idea is multiple increments, multiple pieces of value are delivered. And this, I mean, it even says in the guide, there's no, sprint review is not a gate for things to be released. It should be going through as you go. But it's that rounding up of, okay, this is where we said we were. This is where we are now. This is where we're going next. And I think that's a very powerful tempo for any team.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you've said some fun things here, I think, for people to start considering. I'm seeing some good questions coming in. We'll jump over to those in a moment. Before we jump to the questions, I would love to hear from you. Like, what would you recommend if a team's considering this, like brand new to the concepts we're talking about today, and they're looking to add some Kanban to their Scrum? Where would you recommend they start?
Start with what you've got. So teams have a definition of workflow. It's just not written down. So, teams have a process for doing work because they already know their product and they already work through. So actually sit down and think about, these are the various activities that happen with our pieces of work. And, those are usually something like, a requirements breakdown, be that before or after work is counted as started. Some form of development. I'm assuming software industry here because this is all I've ever worked in. But some form of development, some form of QA, some sort of functional testing, non-functional testing. Some might have external, teams in to do all sorts of security and things like that. But understand what the workflow is for the piece of work. Write that down. Understand what the definition of done is, and then work backwards. And actually, which of these are in those? Which is actually a definition of done and which is a column exit criteria. Then you've obviously got sort of the flow metric side of try to understand, once you've defined what that system is, trying to understand how it's currently performing. Do we have a throughput of one every 6 months? Hopefully not. What do those cycle times look like? What's the SLAs? I saw a great example of it where somebody was trying to put, and I think, to be fair, he was doing it as an example, but something like a column exit criteria was because the boss says so. But making it visible is about, okay, maybe that policy could be improved slightly. Maybe there are actually policies that are being broken down. I think he called it improvement through embarrassment, which I quite liked. But yeah, document what you've got, understand how the system is improving, look at where that system needs to improve, and actively
I
manage
love
work.
those
That's the other
sessions
bullet
too.
point.
Yeah, just what you said, right? So going through defining your workflow and your exit policies, I feel like is something that sounds so simple as I say that, right? Just get together and talk about how work moves and what has to be true to move to each next stage of the workflow. I think they're always the funniest sessions to run with a team, whether it's team level, program level, portfolio level, because you tend to uncover all these misconceptions or places where the team's not aligned. I might think that things have to go through one code review, and you might think they have to go through 2 code reviews, and one code review has to be a different team member. There's all these things, right? And we tend to assume that everybody's working under the same guidelines for that workflow. And then when we have those sessions, we uncover all these things where it's like, well, I thought you were going to push to the test environment. Oh, I thought the tester was going to push it to the test environment. And so getting that clarity, I think, can also just be a really great place to start to implement some of these new practices for your Scrum team, because you're probably operating with a lot of misconceptions and assumptions without that conversation.
What I like as well is it's non-threatening.
Yeah.
We're not asking people to start measuring their own, on a set of metrics they've never come across. We're just asking, write down what we currently do. In theory, that's quite straightforward, but as you say, when you actually start having those conversations, it sometimes uncovers things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I see a workflow question here from Jovan. He said, question for Adam, did all the teams where you've applied visualization of the workflow had the same workflow across the org, or was it customized per team that every team had to have their own?
So personally, we have different workflows for different teams. The reason for that is large organization, lots of everything from different environments, different requirements. We're building different products. So to have those products needing to use a fixed definition. Having said that, we also have, there are some things that teams are required to do, code reviews, for example. You can't just write whatever you want and stick it in production. So there are elements in there. So there's real potential here, right? Because what you can do is you can immediately start linking your definition of workflow up to what those standardized, standards and policies across the department are. And actually, how do you demonstrate you've done this? Well, it's built into our definition of workflow. So then when we progress past that, but yeah, team space have different products with potentially different environments, different activities, so different definitions of workflow.
Yeah, and I think even expanding on that a little bit, Jovan, I think some of the things I've seen, it depends heavily on the organization's rules and structures around the tools that they use, unfortunately. I think for a lot of larger scale companies that are running, let's say, Jira, the workflows tend to be less configurable team by team. Maybe inside of a team of teams, you have some flexibility, like they're all doing the same, and then program to program can be slightly different. I do think you can still get kind of creative with your column structure in Jira, even if your workflow is a little more rigid, so that you can at least visualize how work is moving across your workflow, even though the state that the ticket is in may stay the same for a couple of those columns. Now, that does have an impact on some of the data you'll be able to get out. But I think it at least starts to help visualize where the work actually is in your workflow, even if you can't modify the workflow behind the scenes.
I think where this gets really interesting as well is where you've got multiple teams working on the same product, be it a lesser Nexus structure or some others. But yeah, because in that case, you want to standardize as much as possible, because actually, if you've got one team working on a product, another team working on a product, and they've got different definitions, then how do you know those are going to connect when you start integrating? So yeah, in that case, definitely work in between. So I would almost say try to anchor it to the product rather than the organization or the team.
Yeah. Jovan's got another question for you around data. You said you started extracting and analyzing the data. Did you use any particular tool or something you've created on your own?
So I'm a nerd, so I did it on my own. So the reason for this was I kind of took one of the comments, I think it was one of Dan Vacanti's books, very much to heart, of if you don't understand what the tools are presenting you, then how do you know that it's right? And I also wanted to understand how this stuff worked. So yeah, I downloaded into a CSV file. I had activated date, close date, and I started working out the cycle times from there and the throughputs from there. And then I started using that data and started building my own Monte Carlos and things. I realized that approach might not be for everyone, but yeah, that was part of the fun, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a great activity, even if you're just doing it for like one sprint's worth of data. It gets you familiar, I think, with what's going on behind the scenes. And like you said, I think a lot of the tools, like if you tried to even compare something like a CFD from one tool to another, how some of those things get interpreted on the back end of the tools varies wildly. And so you might be looking at kind of different sets of data or different perspectives on what it's tracking. Yeah. I think the spreadsheet method really can be a great place to get started. Jira is a little tricky sometimes to get the right data out of it, but I know there's a few links on the ProKanban website to some examples. I think I think there's one for Jira and one for Azure DevOps on how to get your data out and start to run some things to see like not just cycle time, but what's our time per stage of our workflow. So you can start to figure out where is work getting stuck and really target making some improvements to your flow from there. Awesome. Okay, let's see. What other questions do we have here? Kanban teams usually do not want to hear the words sprint or iteration. How do you influence teams to set up checkpoints that are aligned to the cadence of the ART? So ART being Agile Release Train.
I don't have a lot of experience in this because I've come from Scrum teams and now sort of learning more about Kanban, and I've never worked in SAFe. So probably not a question for me. Hopefully maybe one Colleen can answer.
Yeah, this one is, I think there's a couple things to consider here when you're thinking about the cadence of an ART, right? So the teams, maybe the ART is a 10 or 12 week release train cadence. So you have that the teams may need to align to. My experience for Kanban teams, and I would agree with that sentiment, they're probably not looking for a sprint or iteration, is how do you line up, how do you first identify what are the things we need to do as a team that we're coming from maybe those cadence-based events in Scrum. I mentioned reviewing stories before we pull them into the to-do column, maybe reviewing metrics on things that are coming out of our system for a retrospective. So those are the things we need to do, and then ask, when do we need to do those? I've seen teams that do them as part of their dailies. So at stand up, you might say, hey, we have space for something in the to-do column. Before we pull something in, we're going to figure out what the next highest priority item is. And here in our stand up as a team, we're going to review that work, make sure it's as small as possible and valuable, that we understand the scope of the acceptance criteria, and then we'll put it into that to-do column. So it's like a more just on time or just in time or on demand style to some of those events. I do tend to see Kanban teams keep some kind of cadenced retrospective, maybe monthly or every 2 weeks if they're newer, so that they have a place set aside to review that data. But as they practice Kanban for a longer period of time, some teams do that the same way I just described. So it's at a stand up, right? It's we're gonna move something to done and then quickly look at the metrics for that item and talk about how our system's working and if there's any changes we want to make to it. So I think it tends to start to evolve into that more just in time. Otherwise, I think you start to see that you still have some kind of cadence from Scrum, like Adam has been talking about here. I hope that helps. Let's see, what else? All right. I see a question here that I don't know that we can answer unless you can, Adam, about Kanban Plus, which is a new tool out. I'm not super familiar with the tool itself. Do you know anything about it?
No, I've not used it, I'm afraid.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not
Sorry.
sure I can answer that one either. I think that's a tool from Kanban University. And Kevin, welcome, Kevin. The aim of Kanban is to make troubles come to the surface. You mentioned this earlier. Did adding Kanban help your flow? And if so, what were some of the culprits that were hindering flow?
I think yes, it's definitely a help flow, and different teams are able to visualize more work going through. Some of the big corporates, I'm afraid to say you won't find surprising. It's about waiting in other queues. One of the biggest challenges I think if any organization wants to get for a certain size is that you've got we need assistance from this team to be able to do this, and I feel awful saying that, because although it's something everyone will go from, well, rule one of Scrum, the team should have everything they need to be able to go to get to live, but equally, real life. I would say that very much the normal culprits. So it's things like sign-offs, it's things like regular things that happen in the organization that only happen a couple of times a week, waiting potentially for deployment windows, things like that. So in personally, my experience, it hasn't necessarily highlighted stuff we didn't know. What I think is very beneficial is being able to quantify some of that and be able to say, actually, this is the impact it's having on an individual piece of work, rather than necessarily throwing things that we were really unsurprised about.
Yeah.
Or really surprised about, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think there can be some fear in some of this data from the team that's like, oh, it's going to shine a light on how long it's taking me to do development or test or, anything. And it's like, the goal here isn't to ever make the people on our team work faster or harder or more hours, right? It's really about what you just said. It's about exposing where work is getting stuck in the system, so that we can address those places where work is stuck. And it's often where work isn't happening, right? Those are the things where we need to improve or expose that something is stuck. It's very rarely about making anybody work faster or harder.
So I've got a story on this one. So in my previous life as a developer, I did a bug fix, and it only happened on a certain day of the year, and the following year I did that bug fix again because it hadn't been rolled out to all the customers. I dread to think what the cycle time was on that, but that's a perfect example of when you were actually, I invested a whole load of time and effort to get to the bottom of this one. Not easy to reproduce because it wasn't that day anymore. So I went and did that. And then you look at the cycle time and you look at how long it took for that to get out, and the value of the work I produced to be to get there. And because we hadn't got it that far, it needed to go all the way back. So it's about another way of framing that is I'm putting in effort to do work to produce value, but unless that we get the value for that out, where's the benefit? So it's not about saying, oh, why did this piece of work take so long? It's about understanding where my effort was wasted or almost wasted.
Yeah.
where that return didn't happen.
I would love to be able to go back and look at that ticket, Adam, and say, what happened here? Did we block it, or did we move it back into the backlog?
I still wake up with cold sweats thinking about that one.
Yeah, like how'd we lose track of that, right? Because work item age would also probably help drive that conversation of, hey, it looks like this has been sitting and ready to deploy for a couple months. Like, what's going on here?
Well, I can answer that. With the wonderful benefit of hindsight, definition of done didn't involve going out to a customer, multiple deployments, lack of automated deployment. This was going back a while, so but yeah, and it really highlights the value of what we're talking about now, because understanding, okay, the team might have its own definition of workflow, but actually, where does work start from a customer perspective, and where does it get stuck from a customer to customer perspective? Because I got paid for doing that bug fix, but then I got paid again for having to redo it all that time later. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things too we struggle with. Like a lot of teams, and this comes up a lot for blockers, right? It's like, I can't continue to work on this. My work here is done, right? Your development piece is done, but I don't want to keep staring at this ticket and having the same conversation. So we move those things out of the way, but that's often how they get lost. And they end up like this, right? Great example. All right, let's see. I have another question for you from our audience. What is the great tool that you suggest or recommend for Kanban and Scaled Agile or SAFe or Nexus, as not all tools support Kanban and scaling or Scaled Agile?
I haven't done huge amounts of scaling multiple so most of my experience has been actually teams working on multiple products. So it's almost the opposite problem of trying to work that way. So yeah, I haven't used a tool that beyond a pen and paper of how you would do that. My strategy would usually be export the data and do it myself, but again, that's because that's the background I came from. So I don't know if there's a tool out there that would put all those bits together for you. I'm also not even sure you'd want one, because that almost puts the framework in place for you as opposed to adapting it to your context. But that's where you might know the perfect things that people should be using.
No, I don't either. I would agree with your sentiment here. Like, I think that there's some structure in the tools that are really built around the time boxes that a lot of the scaling frameworks introduce. They're almost kind of counter to what you're trying to build from a continuous flow perspective in Kanban. So they might contradict the goals of some of those practices. Now, if you're bringing some of those things together, I think you can absolutely make Jira work. We recommend Actionable Agile a lot for Jira teams to be able to get the data they need out without doing all the fancy Excel spreadsheet work that Adam talked about. But I think there aren't a lot of tools that I think blend all of these practices together in a really nice way, unfortunately. Kanbanize is a tool that I think works really well for scaling Kanban and can help provide a lot of the structure and visibility at different levels of your Kanban systems, but it's not going to probably check the box for the Scaled Agile, like the Scaled Agile events and time boxes that you're trying to follow.
So just in case tool is talking about framework rather than an app out there or something you can use, I don't have a huge amount of experience across the board of them, so I've never used SAFe. I have a next to no experience on less. What I sort of academically know about, because I've done some reading and some, is more Nexus. So in my mind, Nexus works quite well, because the main difference, as I understand it, between Nexus and some of the other scale frameworks is you've got multiple teams working to create a single increment, and as opposed to having things like a scrum of scrums, you have a Nexus stand up afterwards. So the idea is that the entire nexus of scrum teams will then meet and produce a larger increment than any one of them could have done individually. So the reason I like that when you're talking about Kanban is because we're still producing value. We're not talking about one piece that needs to be integrated here and then ultimately into a large deployment. So in my mind, those are the two that would work quite nicely together. And at some point when I've got the head time, I would really like to put some of the Nexus ideas together with some of the simplified scaling work that Pratik's been talking about. But I would not want to preach that I've done it or know the. But yeah, just in case you talk about tool and as in framework rather than tool as in online
approach. Yeah. Yeah, if anyone out there listening has experience kind of pulling these things together too, like Adam's talking about, we'd love to invite you to the conversation here. A big part of what we're trying to
I'd
do
watch that.
with Kanban for everyone is continue these conversations about how Kanban can be used as a strategy to make what you're doing better. And so if it's Nexus, right, that's a great example where starting to think about flow and scaling. Call me. Let's talk about it. We want to keep sharing these stories with everyone. Giovanni, I missed your question here. I apologize. So there's a question for you around value. Adam, did you use some metrics that are value oriented, something extracted from the EBM framework, or oh, and then he added, okay, by looking at flow metrics, we are looking at, are we effective and efficient, but how did you measure value of the things that you built?
No, I think any answer here I give would be make you up an answer based on. No, I think the you've sort of hit the nail on the head, though, that when we talk about Kanban, we talk about delivering value. We're not talking about delivering work. And what, as Colleen mentioned earlier, with tasks underneath. So be very, very careful when we're talking about, how long does it take to complete this task? Because that might not actually be a useful cycle time in terms of gaining that knowledge. But no, I haven't done a lot with evidence-based management.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Here's another one. I can't see the username on this one, but how to identify common pitfalls in Kanban and how to avoid them.
You've probably got a much better answer to this one than I have, but I think there's almost the oversimplification of both frameworks. I think looking from the outside, I've seen a brilliant blog post about what Kanban users think of Scrum teams and vice versa. I think it's on the scrum.org site. It's worth a read, but I think almost that oversimplification, because when Kanban was originally described to me, right, it was about, oh, well, you can reprioritize the tickets at any point, and when somebody's free, they just pick up the next one. There's no planning or anything like that. And I just went away and thought that was it. So, but yeah, I think just that level of simplicity, because there is so much more to it than that. There's a lot more rigor in when can we pick up this work while still maintaining confidence that we'll be able to hit it as expected without it disrupting the system and things like that. So I think that might be a very simplistic answer to it, but yeah, I would say one of the most common pitfalls I've seen is underestimating it and assuming it's just for ticketing teams.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's a big one. And then I would add, for a lot of teams, I think that start to implement Kanban practices like tracking work item age and creating an SLE for the team to manage the flow of their work against that work item age. We put these things in place. WIP limits are a great example of this too. We say, okay, here's all of our WIP limits, but we never talk about what we're going to do when those signals appear in our system. We're at WIP, or we're at this work item is hit our SLE. And all of these things from a Kanban perspective are intended to drive some action from the team. And so like I'll go work with a team and they'll pull up their Jira board and all their columns are red. And they're like, oh, they're always red. And I'm like, okay, well, what are you going to do about it, right? So all of these things are intended to drive the team to some action, to take action to move that work along. And I think whether you call them working agreements or workflow policies or something else, I would say you have to really make sure that you're having a conversation around with the team around what happens when this event takes place. When a ticket, let's say our SLE is 10 days, 85% of our work will be done in 10 days or less. If a ticket hits 9 days or 10 days, what will we do about it, right? We want to make sure that it's driving us to some action to have the right conversations sooner. So that's another piece of that. I'm going to jump down to Claudia's question real quick since we're talking about WIP limits. She's asking how to define a WIP for a newly formed team. What would be a good cycle time to start with when there is no existing experience of the teams working together? You want to take that, Adam?
The second one's easier. How to define a WIP limit. So this is where I'm trying to be. Speaking with Colleen, I want to make sure I got this absolutely right. My understanding is there is absolutely nothing in Kanban that specifies how you implement your WIP limit. So it's not like you must do it per person, you must do it across the entire board, you must do it by column. So as long as you do it, that's completely up to the context of the team. My suggestion would be for how to define a WIP limit is agree on something sensible and then adjust it. I think that's the harder part of the question. The easier part of the testing is what is a good cycle time? I have no idea because I don't work on your product. I don't know how complicated it is. I might think a great cycle time is a week. You might think a week, we talk hours. It completely depends on your context. What you're doing is you're getting the benchmark and you're understanding how your system is currently performing. There might be teams out there who say, well, we got it done in under 6 months. That's not bad. So that's not to say that that's a bad cycle time, because that might be a phenomenal cycle time given the challenges they're working on. So I wouldn't say there's any such thing as a good cycle time. It's about understanding what your cycle time currently is, looking whether you're happy with that. Really, lower is always better. And the same goes for WIP limits. There's very, very few reasons not to lower a WIP limit unless potentially you want to artificially bottleneck something.
Yeah. I hope that helps, Claudia. And I think that conversation, like Adam's saying, around WIP limits, that, I think it's setting them, but then getting buy-in that we're as a team going to adhere to them. And when something new comes in, what's going to happen, right? If we're all, if our WIP is at its capacity and an urgent request comes in, we need to, as a team, have a plan for how we handle those things. Because if I'm the one, if I'm the one on the team where Adam knows he can come directly to me and I'm going to pull that work in and maybe not show it on the board, or keep starting new things without having a conversation with the team, then those WIP limits aren't really driving the right conversations for us anyway. So back to that piece around what's our team's agreements on how we make this actionable and visible becomes really important.
I would echo that. I'm thinking of the Mike Tyson quote. And, at some point you're going to get an incident. You're going to get something that proverbially punches you in the face. Far better to agree up front what's going to happen, when that happens, whether that is you do breach your WIP limit.
Right.
The example I give when I'm training this is, right, okay, so incident management are on the phone and the entire online system is down, and if you want to explain to them about WIP limits and how they can temporarily your ticket will be the next one that will picked up, and we have an SLE of, and then there's the one that will help you keep your job, which is the one that okay, we're going to break the WIP limit, we're going to resolve this issue because we need to resolve this issue. Hopefully the cycle time will be absolutely fantastic and we'll have all the people we need and all the ways we should be working, hopefully without a little less stress. And then what happens is we let it drain out and we don't pick up more work until we're back under the WIP limit. But far better to have that conversation before you're on the phone with incident management than afterwards or during.
Absolutely. That's a great example and great advice. Kevin's got a good question for you here about leaders. So you mentioned using Monte Carlo forecasting instead of capacity planning using story points. How have product leaders, business leaders, and clients liked that? Has it been beneficial to have better data-driven discussions?
Can you ask me again in a few months?
We'll have you back.
No, the reason being, this is something that I'm working on very, very much at the moment and trying to, we have a lot of teams and we have a lot of different managers and so on. And like I say, I would never dream of forcing anyone to use a tool that isn't appropriate for their context. So what I'm doing very much at the moment is trying to build up trying to make it as easy as possible for people to trial this. So what I'm doing is I'm building Monte Carlos, but also specifically with the roadmap, the more scaled ones where we're using epics and we're estimating the number of story points and number of stories underneath to try and right size our epics and going down that route. And then what that gives us is a really nice probabilistic view of where the different longer term pieces of work are going to land. I'm hoping it's going to be really, really well received. There's a couple of things that I hadn't considered before I started having the conversations. Things like, well, now we're talking about a range of dates when we're expecting things to be available, which is great if you're communicating to a high confidence date to the business and the customers and the stakeholders. But you also need to think about keeping clear when you're most likely to arrive, because that is still a very important metric. Right. We're not just getting rid of that because we're treating the high confidence. And also in a larger organization, there are people who are involved in teeing up work and the next piece of work and making sure that's available. So you almost want to have 3 dates. It's not just 85%, that's where we're going for. You want to have okay, this is our pessimistic date. this is the date we are, quote, tracking towards as our most likely date. But there's also the just make sure we've got work here in case we get lucky date, because otherwise the team will be starved of work, because there's obviously upstream processes. So yeah, so far the conversation has been quite positive. I hope to be able to answer that again and say, oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a fascinating conversation to come back and have. And I think it can be difficult, like you said earlier, Adam, to start to implement or introduce some of the Monte Carlo simulations, because it starts to bring up a bunch of different questions about how we're working. And so I think we need to have you back, is what I'm hearing. We need to come back together and hear how it's going with your business leaders and product leaders. Hopefully that we could have them come. They can tell us how much more predictable their delivery has become. Fingers crossed. I see one more question here. I think we've got a couple minutes left, so I'll pull one more in. And this kind of goes back to the example I was using about when you drop all of your conversations as a team, what could go wrong? So in a recent Kanban implementation, I faced an issue with ticket readiness. The lack of process to refine a ticket on a regular basis, the lack of boundaries of the sprints made it quite easy to sneak in some not refined tickets. My approach has been to formalize a planning and commitment session every 2 weeks as a gate to pull in items into ready. What do you think could be done to mitigate the risk of introducing totally unplanned, unprioritized work to the board?
So in our world, we have a backlog refinement session as part of our sprint. So technically, it is not a Scrum event. If you were to go, but I think if you look at most Scrum teams' calendars, they would have this one where it they're in there routinely. The reason it's not a Scrum event is because it's a continuous process that the team need to do, which I actually quite like, because then that becomes part of the definition of workflow for each one. So if you extend your board out a little bit before the team get there, you can see this coming in. You can see it being prioritized further across. The scenario you're talking about, though, seems very much like it's just been dropped on. It hasn't been through those refinement processes, and it's sort of landing up front. I think that's when your column criteria become really, really important, because if something, for example, has been moved into development without, for example, the proper acceptance criteria or the proper, tests or whatever your criteria, then it can't progress any further. So because it hasn't met those requirements. So I think that the Kanban approach and the definitions of workflow are really, really useful, because they help highlight this. It'll always happen, and if it's a server offline, the acceptance criteria is quite straightforward. Get it up and running again. But there are always things that sneak in more than that. But I think by being able to explicitly state what you're expecting in each state of the column, that sounds very sensible to me. And yeah, a ready column is good.
And I think another option you can always consider here too is to make the review part of your workflow, right? That's taking capacity from your team to do that review work away from their ability to do other work. So having a WIP constrained review column helps you manage the fact that you're taking time away from doing work to review incoming work. So you could also do a column on your board that's a review state that is WIP constrained, to say, at any given time, we'll have 2 tickets in this review column, and that's the next work items that we're reviewing, and then they'll go into a ready for dev column after that, or something like that. So you can also either manage it through policies like Adam recommended, or make that stage a visible WIP constrained stage of your workflow.
I think that's nice as well, because you'll be able to see when the team's potentially going to be starved of work or things like that as well. So.
Yeah. All right, that pretty much brings us to the top of the hour. This went by super fast. Great questions, great advice here from Adam on the practical side of bringing together Scrum and Kanban and helping your team focus on flow. So Adam, thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. We really appreciated that you took the time not only to join this conversation, but all of your contributions to the Pro Kanban community and the blog and everything you've done to share your journey here. It's so important that we get to hear from real examples of this, and not just the books. And so we appreciate all of the storytelling and sharing you've done with the community here and at Pro Kanban. So thank you so much. Join us next month for the next Kanban for Everyone. and we will be posting the recording from this session on our YouTube channel. So thanks everyone for joining, listening in, and sharing your questions and feedback with us. See you next month.
Well, thank you very much.